Hi, want to hear something scary?
It was that time again, time for our town's annual carnival, a well-loved autumn tradition despite the odd mishap or disappearance that would occur. The carnival was always welcomed back each year. I'd be going with Brian and Anne, a couple of wallflowers, but also the only friends I had from school. The sun was setting as we headed inside the carnival. String lights in every color decorated all the booths and rides. The smell of hot dogs and funnel cakes wafted through the air. The crowd was thick, and everyone's attention was scattered, so I reached out and slapped a little boy's tub of popcorn out of his hand. The fluffy kernels flew up as I tipped my head back and laughed at his shocked face. Anne and I wanted to ride the Ferris wheel first, but Brian didn't want to, saying something about loose supports and the tired worker at the controls. Looking at it, it did seem like the whole thing was going to fall apart, but I wasn't about to back down. I teased Brian until we were all finally loaded into the Ferris wheel car. The wheel turned, taking us up, and over the carnival. I loved heights and looked over at Brian. I started making our car rock and squeak. Brian covered his face with his hands. Stop doing that, he exclaimed. I laughed at him as I peered out across the carnival. From this high up, I spotted an old carousel, hidden behind some trees. It was lit up, but nobody was near it. No line? That would be our next ride. It was further away than the other attractions. It was dark out now and quiet. And Brian and I approached the carousel. It was surprisingly rusty, with chipped paint and some of the lights crowning the top were burnt out. Brian and Anne stopped as I walked closer to get a better look. The horses had seen better days, and they were worn and rusted, smiling figures dancing along the center circle. In the center column of the carousel were faded portraits of laughing clowns. "This one seems really messed up. I'm out," Anne said. Well, I hadn't walked out here for nothing. I wasn't scared of a kiddie ride. Jeering at them both, I boarded the carousel alone and vaulted onto a palomino horse. As soon as I did, the lights of the carousel glowed brightly, and cheery music began to play. Creaking to life, it started to turn. I grinned as the music got louder and my horse rode up and down, around, faster and faster, until Brian and Anne were blurred figures among the trees. The carousel kept twirling, faster and faster. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy and stiff. Out of the corner of my eye, it looked like one of the dancing figures had started moving. But when I looked right at it, they were all still. I wanted to get off. I slid off the horse. I was spinning so fast. I was so dizzy. Something grabbed me. The dancing figures. While I wasn't looking at them, they had been moving. And not only them. My mouth stretched into a wide, disbelieving grin as the laughing clowns on the walls came to life, reaching out, grabbing my other arm. And I started being yanked between the dancing figures and the laughing clowns as the carousel spun faster and faster, and the music got louder and louder, and I was being pulled by both of them harder and harder. Anne and Brian watched the carousel, mouths agape. It was so blurred they couldn't even see their friend. Something wet and warm splashed against Anne's face. She pressed her hand against her face, and looking down, she saw that it was blood. Brian screamed as an arm was flung in front of him. Finally, the carousel began to wind down. Horses slowing as the music faded. The blood splattered across the carousel. Anne and Brian's screams trailed off into the distance. I stood frozen and rust amid the strange figures trapped on the carousel. My last wide grin frozen before it could become the scream I meant for it to be. My body was torn apart, but my soul would stay and ride this carousel forever.
I had never planned to move back to Kentucky, but after my mom passed away, I took my son Tyler through the Appalachian Mountains and headed back to my childhood home. Lots of things creep me out about Kentucky. especially the legend of Sprinkles, the killer clown. In 1973, a caravan of circus performers were making its way across the mountains when a bad storm set in. The icy roads finally got the better of the caravan, and the cars piled up on the side of the road. Many died at the scene, and one of those vehicles, carrying 5 clowns, wasn't discovered for days. Finally, the police found 3 remaining clowns who had survived and revealed the fate of the rest of their party from the wreck. And it was pretty grim. A clown known as Sprinkles, who was not part of the group, had kept them tied up like hostages. Sprinkles forced the hostages to eat the dead performers from the wreck and said that he had planned on eating them too if he couldn't keep his hunger down. It wasn't until one of the victims got his hands free that he was able to untie the others. Years later, pictures taken on a trail cam in eastern Kentucky showed Sprinkles very much alive. Although photos were shown all over the news, he was never caught. The story had terrified me as a kid, and I was lost in thought when the sounds of the ice cream truck jolted me back to reality. We headed over to where it had stopped, and wouldn't you know it, the driver was a clown. My stomach clenched. His smile was wide as we approached him, and I didn't know if it was paranoia, but I swear he was staring directly at my son. Tyler seemed a bit surprised, but went about ordering his cone with chocolate sprinkles.
Great choice, kid,
said the clown, then looked over at me. I started taking my wallet out, but he waved his hand.
No charge today. Just delicious ice cream. Bye now.
He waved his goodbyes and drove off. I was left feeling slightly confused. Despite his creepy appearance, the clown was surprisingly polite. The next day, the ice cream truck returned, blasting the same music from its speakers.
Ice cream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream.
The same line repeated over and over again. I still don't really like the idea of Tyler heading out by the truck alone, so I walked out with him. The clown waved at us, as he had done so on the previous day, and handed Tyler a chocolate cone with sprinkles. This time, he looked over at me and said $3.50. I laughed at first, since yesterday he said it was free. But then he told me that was only for new customers. I thought to myself. I'd left my wallet inside the house. I took a deep breath, and with one eye on Tyler, I hurried back in and grabbed a $5 bill and raced outside. He handed me the change and drove off.
See you tomorrow, kid,
he called out. The next day, at the same time, I heard the familiar song. This continued every day for weeks, and then months, and each time after buying an ice cream and chatting with the guy, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could trust this particular clown after all.
The usual?
He asked Tyler, who'd nod, licking his lips while I paid. Then he'd drive off with his music blaring. On the last day of Tyler's summer break from school, I was watching TV when I heard the familiar song. Tyler came running down the stairs. My program was interrupted with a breaking story. I told Tyler to grab my wallet and go get ice cream by himself today. Tyler jumped for joy as he grabbed the money and ran outside. The newscaster mentioned that over the past few months, kids have started to go missing, and witnesses are saying that a clown has targeted kids who were alone and pulled them into his truck. A picture popped up on the screen of a clown that looked familiar, same wig and costume. My heart skipped a beat. It was Sprinkles, the killer clown. Tyler, I screamed as I jumped from the couch and ran outside. Grabbing my keys between my fingers, I saw Tyler reaching out for his ice cream. Tyler, get away, I shouted. The clown dropped the ice cream, and in seconds, I reached the truck and swung my hand holding the keys, stabbing him in the eye. He fell to the ground screaming, blood pouring down his face. I knew he was a child killer and a cannibal. I was glad I had stopped him. Grabbing Tyler, we locked ourselves inside and waited for the police to arrive. As I held Tyler close, I explained what I'd seen on the news. I turned up the volume to show him, and that's when the news anchor announced that the police had caught the guy who had been snatching children, and he was now in custody. But if they caught that guy, then what had I done? Tyler looked at me with real fear in his eyes, only this time the fear was directed at me. I had just attacked an innocent man because of a costume he was wearing, because of a conditioning I'd been exposed to that all clowns were dangerous. As these sirens approached our house, I couldn't help but wonder, if the real Sprinkles had been caught, was I now the monster?
Araceli and Jeff were excited to move into their new home. They had been married for a few weeks and finally found the perfect place by the woods. Their moving boxes were neatly stacked by the shed near the end of the driveway. Araceli noticed an old box with yellow tape she couldn't recall packing, but it had her name on it. When she sliced it open with the box cutter, she found some old belongings. Her mom must have added the box to their things. It was filled with old photos and mementos from her childhood home that she hadn't seen since she left for college. She pulled out a horn, a keepsake she had from a school trip to the circus long ago. Without thinking, she honked the horn, and the memories came flooding back. She remembered leaving a red and yellow circus tent and following her classmates into the funhouse right next to it. She lost herself in the multitude of mirrors, and when she emerged from the funhouse, she realized she had missed the bus back to school. She didn't remember how long she was in there, only that she had found a toy horn. She squeezed it, and as it echoed through the maze, a clown appeared. What was his name? Its face bore a smile, and it danced all around her. He helped her find a way out. She would never be alone, it promised. Just give the horn a honk whenever she needed him. Outside, there were ambulance lights everywhere. While she had been stuck in the funhouse, there had been a terrible school bus accident. She was the only survivor of the tragedy. A woman standing on the street told her it had crashed when a circus clown crossed in front of it, causing it to swerve off the road and killing everyone on board. Flopsy? Fancy Flopsy? She recalled the clown's name aloud. Jeff laughed nervously. Fancy Flopsy sounds creepy. He probably wouldn't like me stealing you from him, he joked, trying to lighten the mood as he took some boxes of things upstairs. Araceli is my girl. When they were done unpacking, they opened the shed to put up their seasonal holiday decorations. That's when she saw it, standing in the center, a funhouse mirror. Araceli was taken aback from the coincidence, first the horn and now the mirror. Jeff, what is this doing here? She asked, seeing someone cross behind her reflection. When she looked closer, she realized that it wasn't Jeff. It was Fancy Flopsy giving her a wave. When she turned around, she almost crashed into Jeff, who had come back out with more boxes in hand. She laughed at herself. Sorry, I just got caught up in a memory, I guess. In bed later that night, she wondered if she had really imagined Fancy Flopsy. She'd left the bathroom light on and the door open a crack just to be safe. From what? She wasn't sure. Her memories of him were scattered after they'd met. Should she be afraid of him? She wondered. He was her imaginary friend growing up and had left him behind when she got older. As her eyes grew heavy, she saw a figure moving in the room. Jeff must have gotten up, but then he snored right behind her. Suddenly wide awake, her vision cleared and she saw a powder white face with fancy red makeup cracked around beady eyes and smeared over an elongated smile. The face of someone she hadn't seen in such a long time, someone she thought she imagined earlier, and began to recall how very real he was.
Fancy Flopsy is your friend. Fancy Flopsy has found you again,
the clown said from the mirrored closet as the light went out. Araceli screamed in the darkness and the blankets were ripped off of her. With a clown honk and laugh, Flopsy's voice was all around her.
I found you!
What's going on? Jeff shouted, flipping the light switch on near the mirrored closet. Before Araceli could answer, Flopsy jumped out of the mirror and held the box cutter above Jeff. The clown laughed as he began to slash Jeff.
No one can take my Araceli away from me.
Araceli tried yelling at the clown to stop, but its mouth began to absorb Jeff. Its hair coiled around his body. She blacked out. When she woke up, she heard the toilet flush. When she rubbed her eyes, she saw Jeff standing over her, wishing her a good morning. After she explained her horrible dream, Jeff hugged her close. "It's okay, honey. No one can take me away from you," he said at his reflection in the mirror, which revealed his true identity. A smile crossed Fancy Flopsy's face as he held his long-awaited prize, Araceli.
At just 10 years old, I found myself in yet another psychiatrist's office. The third one, to be exact. This time, the doctor had me sketch and take Rorschach tests. Desperate to understand what was going on in my young mind, but he came to the same conclusion as everyone else: childhood schizophrenia. I initially dismissed the concept, yet the haunting imagery of my past continued to replay in my mind. There was no denying that girl creeping into my room had to be real. I had been safe for months, but the time I most feared was now here. Another loose tooth. I didn't touch it. I even stopped eating so nothing would shake it, because I never wanted that demon to come near me again. I woke up that terrible night and I looked at the clock. 3:33 a.m. I'm not sure what woke me, but I rolled over and pulled my comforter closer to my chest. But then I heard it, the buzzing sound like a chainsaw in the distance. I pressed my pillow against my ears to quiet the noise, but it only became louder. As I sat up in my bed, a wave of dizziness hit me, and I became aware of the growling sensation in my stomach. Maybe I'm just hungry, I thought to myself, and I decided to slip out for a midnight snack. But as I heard the door slowly creak open, I knew it would be best to lay back down quickly. After all, if my mom caught me awake, I'd surely be in trouble. All of a sudden, an overpowering stench attacked my nostrils. As the buzzing grew louder, it almost seemed to muffle all other sounds. I pretended to be asleep, hoping that whatever it was would go away. The shadow slithered across my room as I turned just enough to catch a blurry glimpse of it. I clenched my eyes and hoped not to scream. The irritating buzz was nearby. The creature was probably right above me. And then suddenly, the pungent stench of a sour odor made me gasp, as if a dead rat was left cooking in the sun. My eyes were burning. I didn't want to turn over, but I had to see what was causing the rotten stench.
"Mine, all mine, shiny, pretty pearls,"
a voice whispered, eerily resembling that of a young child, sending shivers down my spine. Slowly, I rolled back over to catch a glimpse. In the faint gleam of my nightlight, she appeared before me, a ghastly pale girl. Her skin looked blood-drained, hued, a grayish blue. She was tiny, like a small child, and covered in crusty reddish-brown bloodstains. The stains matted the tips of her short pink hair and bangs. She had a sick smile, her lips curling at the corners as she cackled and giggled. Her wings were scraggly and torn, yet somehow she managed to carry herself across my room, buzzing in my face. I couldn't scream. The air was so thick around me, it was making me woozy. I knew exactly who this was. The girl of my nightmare from months ago. She pounced, straddling me and pulling a pair of faded pink pliers out from behind her back. She screeched a horrific high pitch. Her voice dripped with a sense of stress and urgency. But while she was screaming, I saw something even worse. Her mouth, it wasn't really a mouth, more of a rotting black maw. She had barely any teeth, and those that remained in the void were misplaced, like a patchwork nightmare. I struggled against her grip, knocking her against my bedside lamp, turning it on. Her image became clear in the light. There was a crown on top of her head, jeweled with teeth, patterned like macabre diamonds. Rotting flesh and unknown gunk rained from her mouth like a mist. I understood the scent of death and decay lingering around her. It was worse than ever. We struggled against each other's grips for an agonizing amount of time. I was crying out for help, but no one was listening. I flung her off my bed and onto the floor. She ripped me down with her. My head slammed against my bedpost, and fear gripped me. She dug her stained nails into my skin, shoving the pliers into my mouth. They tasted of rust and blood. She wrapped them around the one loose baby tooth. "Mine," she snarled, and kept repeating it with a growing intensity. Her voice tinged with excitement. The moment my tooth tore from the gum, blinding pain shredded through me, causing me to gag. As my vision went white, the pain vanished, but my body was left in shock, quickly falling numb. And after that, everything went black. Waking hours later, everything looked completely normal. The house was still. The only thing out of place was a small pile of silver coins on the floor and the unbearable painful hole in my jaw. I couldn't possibly have imagined the degree of excruciating pain, but I had no proof it had happened. No one will believe that she was a monster, and I'll just be labeled insane again. But I'm not. I've seen her. She haunts me, the evil tooth fairy.
Poe originally opens his story with this. The Red Death had long devastated the country. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the madness and the horror of blood. The Red Death is what it was called. It was a mysterious disease that consumed victims quickly with sharp pains, dizziness, and profuse bleeding from every orifice and pore on the body. Faces stained red in the clutches of death would reach out, but doing so would latch onto death's next victim. Ways to outrun it were growing scarce. Prospero's sanctuary was a retreat in a ranch estate. It boasted that it lay far from the Red Death that was spreading. For the right price and/or amount of followers, those who held high positions, who held old money, are influenced and entertained could qualify for the luxurious commune. But only those who were sure through thorough testing they didn't carry the Red Death could enter, or were rich enough to where the testers would look the other way. After all, people like that surely couldn't catch what the common folk had. Led by tech innovator Princeton Prospero, his state-of-the-art sanctuary invited his many guests to ride out the plague in a space filled with lavish amenities. State-of-the-art gym equipment, fireside chats to build community, and of course, parties. Their lives would no longer be disrupted by the plague. The strict guidelines of separation were for the general public, not for those at Prospero's sanctuary. They were above following such restrictions. Sanctuarians were equipped with Prospero's state-of-the-art smartwatches, keeping them up to date on their vitals, on activities, and most importantly, the percentage spread of the Red Death around the country. When the percentage went down to 0, they could leave. To keep his guests distracted, Prospero planned a great festival to celebrate his ingenuity in protecting his sanctuary. A great masked ball was held in the great ballroom, with an unveiling of masks scheduled at midnight. The decorations were illuminated by stained glass windows lined in red, an ironic decoration. Within, there was wine, beauty, and security. Without was the Red Death. That night, masked guests would pause to uneasily look at their watches. The smartwatch alerts were like a knell. Numbers of deceased without were growing, and for a moment, an air of stillness would pass over the guests. Then, with mirth and laughter, they'd go back to drinking and dancing under their masked guises as the midnight hour drew near. Then, cutting through the party, a sound went off on some people's wrists. Spotted here and there, echoing through the hall, alarms flashing red from their smartwatches. Worried, Prospero realized that was a different alert, one that meant contagion.
Impossible. It must be a glitch in the system,
he reasoned. While puzzling that out, he heard horrified murmurs of a masked figure among the party. It had appeared and now passed through every area of the sanctuary, with no one daring to stop it. "Did you see their mask?" So tasteful and ghastly. What's going on? What does this mean? Who is that? Where did they come from? Just then, the crowd parted in front of Prospero, and there it was. A tall and gaunt figure with a vermilion red visage that distastefully resembled the faces of the corpses outside. Rage-filled, Prospero demanded,
Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery?
his roar bringing the party to a halt. Head to toe in scarlet, the figure moved forward. Horrified, people backed away, more and more of their wrists sounding and flashing red. Those that wrists had sounded off first were now stricken with dizziness and had begun to bleed from their faces. Screams sounded as more wrist alarms went off and people scattered. Prospero waved his master control, sealing doors tightly in the sanctuary. Glass panes on doors were marked by bloody hands, screaming for escape as they succumbed to the disease that one or more of them had invited inside with them, thereby infecting all the rest. Prospero walked through halls, sealing off the dying, and all the while, silently following him was the tall red figure, following all the way back to the end of the black ballroom. There, they met in a final confrontation. As his smartwatch rang out the hour of midnight, the failed genius leaped forward, ripping his mask off, and as Prospero too was stricken, and his vision filled with the red of his own blood, he gaped at the visage of the pestilent entity. With a cry, Prospero realized they had done this to themselves. No amount of money put one above the Red Death. His own hubris had called it quickly to him, and to the many that had smugly followed him. The world outside would continue to heed the warnings, staying away and in small groups. With lesser means, yes, but they would outlast it. While he, in his glorified, decimated Eden, then dropped dead.
In the countryside of Ardenvale, on the outskirts of Beckborough, there was a family dairy farm that fell upon desperate times. To save the farm, the father sent his eldest daughter, Gertrude, to sell the family mule at the nearest village. After a half-day's travel, Gertrude arrived in the village of Beckborough. She made her way to the marketplace and began asking around. The merchants waved her off or made joke offers on her mule. It was almost enough for her to give up and go home, until she met a charming man in a feather cap. "That's a good, strong animal you have," the man said. "You deserve a good price for a mule like this." He made Gertrude a generous offer, even more than she expected, and traded her mule for a full bag of silver. Cheerful with her fortune, Gertrude skipped and jangled to a building named the Baker's Inn. She decided she could afford a room for the night before embarking home the next morning. The inn was warm and lively, with customers lined up to purchase dinner pies from the bakery counter. Gertrude reached the counter and she met the welcoming eyes of the baker. She eagerly placed a piece of silver on the counter and requested a pie and room for the night. Smiling, the baker placed the silver on his scale, but at that moment, his smile changed to a frown. He grabbed Gertrude by the wrist. "Where did you get this? You can get in a lot of trouble buying goods with plated counterfeits." Gertrude looked down at her bag of silver, confused, and cold reality settled in. She began to weep. "I didn't know. I thought the silver was real, I swear," she pleaded. "The man in the feather cap tricked me. I sold my family mule to him, and now I can never show my face at home." The baker felt bad for losing his temper. "Oh, you poor child. That is not fair." He handed her a pie from the rack and gave her a table to sit and eat. With cheeks still moist, she ate the pie. It was hot and filled with a delicious, very tender beef filling. It was no wonder the bakery had people lined up earlier. It was evening now, and Gertrude had nowhere she could go. But the baker had a proposition. "Young miss, you saw how busy it got in here today. How would you like to work for me? You can live in the spare room and parcel money home to your family." Gertrude was speechless. She hugged the baker, and after he showed her the room, he explained her duties. She would clean, tend the bakery counter, and prepare the guest rooms. Gertrude would have a chance to save the family farm after all. She fell fast asleep. Later that night, she sprung awake to the sound of blood-curdling screams echoing through the walls of the inn. Was this a nightmare? What could she do? Gertrude clutched the sheets to cover herself and laid scared for a long time. But eventually, the screaming ceased, and she drifted back to sleep. At sunrise, Gertrude came downstairs and welcomed a knight in noble silks with a sword at his hip. When the baker came out of the larder, Gertrude asked if he had heard the unsettling screams the previous night. "Oh, what you heard last night," the baker began ominously, "is the inn's worst kept secret. We have a ghost problem. We're lousy with them, in fact. If I'd known better, I wouldn't have built my bakery in a haunted inn. They're a nuisance, yes, but they're harmless, I promise." This statement prompted laughter from the knight across the room. "Sounds like a hoax. I've seen all there is to see. Witches, fairies, redcaps, and trolls, but never a ghost," he said. "Well, tonight, maybe you will," derided the baker. The baker sent Gertrude to prepare the knight's room, and after a long day of sweeping and selling pies, she sat down to a tasty pie of her own. Later that night, she awoke to more terrible screams. But now, instead of being scared, she was just annoyed. She buried her head in her pillow and filled her mind with positive thoughts. Decadent meat pies, her family, the farm. And with that, she drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Gertrude couldn't wait to ask the knight how he slept. But the knight was nowhere to be found. The baker pulled a fresh rack of pies from the oven. "What happened to the knight?" Gertrude asked the baker. "Oh, him?" the baker said dismissively. "He was summoned to an errand for his lord and took off in the night. Care for a pie?" This answer didn't sit well with Gertrude, and the lack of sleep was beginning to wear on her. The rest of the day, customers came in droves, and she was able to distract herself by selling pies. But night came too soon. To Gertrude's surprise, the inn remained silent. Somehow the silence was more unsettling. What, did the ghost decide to take a day off? She got up and crept over to the guest room where the knight stayed before. There was nothing remarkable. It was just empty. She thought she had seen enough until she noticed an odd seam in the wall. She pulled it open to reveal a secret compartment. There, in a pile, laid a hoard of belongings: silks, swords, shoes, and armor. Every instinct told Gertrude it was time to leave. She rushed quietly down the hall, rounded the corner, and then covered her mouth in shock. The baker blocked the doorway to her room, his back turned. He was looking for her. Gertrude moved decisively in the other direction, down the stairs and towards the exit, until suddenly she heard a man crying for help. Risking escape and safety, she followed the cries over to the larder. Inside, Gertrude saw sacks of flour, a bloody butcher's block, and a pile of human skulls. She gagged, now horrified by her new understanding: the pie's secret ingredient. Gertrude found the man who was crying out and immediately began to untie him, and then stopped. There was now a knife held up to her face. It was the baker. "Do you remember this man?" asked the baker. Gertrude glanced at the tied-up man and had a shock of recognition. "Yes," said the baker. "It's the man with the feather cap who humiliated you, and now he's here, at your mercy." She recoiled at the baker's sinister invitation. "Even if he hurt me, nobody deserves this." "I see," said the baker. "But if you let him go, I'll still need meat from someone to make the pies. I can't keep up with demand, you see. It's either him or you." A week later, Gertrude's family began receiving parcels of silver delivered by messenger once per week. Over time, the farm began to flourish again and was doing better than ever. "I miss seeing Gertrude," Father said, "but because of all her hard work, the farm is safe. I just hope she's happy wherever she is." And to this day, they say you can get the tastiest pies in all of Ardenvale if you visit a little haunted inn run by a baker and his assistant. But whatever you do, don't stay for the night.
A broken body, bloodied and bruised, laid on its back. Its limbs were bent in unnatural angles. 60 students circled around him, confused and whispering. What could have been responsible? What could have caused so much damage? It was not what Aaron Klein, a sophomore college, nor the other kids from Oklahoma State expected to find in the woods near the annual bonfire. But there, Aaron was, stiff and cold. His poor girlfriend, Carmela, threw herself on top of his corpse, veering between panic and shock. The police had to drag her off. For weeks, detectives investigated the murder. Carmela called every day only to find that at the end of the first week, they were closing the case. When she arrived at the precinct, ready to protest, they told her new evidence pointed to an animal attack. She refused to believe it. They showed her photos of Aaron's body once it had been cleaned and autopsied. Besides lacerations and broken bones, there were bruising that took a couple of days to show up. It revealed what looked like hoof marks all over on his torso and chest. But what kind of animal could do all of that? The detectives left her to process. Not convinced, Carmela grabbed the files and bolted out the door. She would find out who really murdered her boyfriend herself. Rushing over to her best friend Dia's dorm room, she laid out the paperwork and begged for help. Attempting to console her friend, Dia began looking through the file, occasionally reading interviews with other students. Dia snuck a peek at Carmela and quickly tried to hide the papers. Carmela ripped the file from Dia. It was an account from a girlfriend named Piper, who claimed she had been hooking up with Aaron for months. After rummaging through the stacks of paper, she found more. Evie, Mallory, and Journey were all claiming Aaron had sent them creepy DMs. The detective's chicken scratch noted that Aaron was a player whose girlfriend had no clue. Carmela choked back a sob. Then she noticed another scribble. This saying the cause of death was internal bleeding caused by blunt force from an animal or unknown entity. Dia held Carmela as she wept. Then Dia spoke. Aaron was a creep. It was tragic, but maybe this was the only way. Carmela glared at her friend. She shook as she announced she was going to the woods to find whatever animal hurt Aaron and would kill it herself, and she ran out of the dorm room. And Dia followed after her. Carmela entered the clearing where Aaron's body had been discovered. Using the light from her cell phone, she looked around. The bush behind her began to shake. She turned around and the flash illuminated what had happened to a 10-foot tall animal, something between a deer and a human. It towered over her on 2 legs. Terrified, Carmela chucked her cell phone as hard as she could, hitting the animal square in the face. It shook its head in pain and ran off. Carmela gave chase, this time moving slower without the help of her light, but trying to follow its sound. She stopped abruptly, realizing it was silent. She inched forward slowly, then bang. She bumped into something solid. Dia? She asked in surprise. Dia handed Carmela her phone. As Carmela filled her in, she shone her flashlight and gasped. Dia's nose was broken and bleeding. Carmela slowly began to piece it all together. And she started to back away. Shaking her head, Dia grabbed her arm, forcing her to look down where Dia's hooves were slowly transforming back to human feet. Carmela, in shock, backed up further, falling to the ground. I warned you about him, Dia said. I asked him multiple times to stop with the others or to break up with you. He just laughed. That night I caught him with Piper in the woods. I did it to protect you. But what did you do to his body? Carmela stammered, reliving the horrific image. Once I shapeshift, there's no going back. Aaron would have told, and then how would I protect you? Dia asked. Carmela jumped up and ran toward the school security office. Dia let her go, trailing behind her, knowing she was caught. The security guard opened the door to a distraught Carmela, claiming she knew what had happened to Aaron Klein. The security guard sat her down and asked for details. Carmela looked back at Dia, who was standing outside. Carmela tried to tell the officer about a 10-foot deer and how Aaron lied. And then, all of a sudden, Carmela thought about all the times that Aaron would show up late, and all these memories started flooding back. When the guard asked if there was anything Carmela wanted to add, she looked back at Dia, the friend who only wanted to look after her. "No," she said. "I just thought you should know, so you could keep people out of the woods." Carmela leaned over to embrace Dia. Both their bodies heaved with tears. Miley worked at a coffee and cronuts. She was looking up at the counter when her new coworker, Irina's, walked in. Despite Irina's barely uttering a word her entire shift, Miley was thrilled to be working with anyone besides her boss, Chaz. And Irina seemed to be catching on quickly and focused on getting her work done. Miley was happy to see Richardson, her favorite customer, come through the door. Every day, he ordered the same black coffee and paid for it with a detailed drawing on a napkin. "I love it," said Miley as she stared at the image of a woman with snakes for hair, bat-like wings, and bloody tears streaming down her face. "That's a Fury," Richardson said. Miley pinned it behind her on a corkboard covered in dozens of Richardson's other mythical illustrations. He struck Miley as socially awkward, but his art was amazing. "Furies are deities of vengeance," he continued. "They have to be summoned in order to punish someone. They lash them to death with studded whips." Miley smiled at his colorful imagination, but before she had time to think any more about it, Chaz walked in. "Guess what? I'm being made general manager," he said. Miley's stomach sank, as did her smile. There were already complaints about Chaz from other employees. 3 had quit in the last month due to his temper. Miley had already dodged his anger and his petty outbursts. But now she and Irina's were the only ones left. Irina's was quiet and new and would be harder for Chaz to bully. Miley knew she would be his next target. And it didn't take long. If Miley was running late, he'd shove warning papers in her face. He told her to quit school because this is as far up the corporate ladder she'd get. One night, he berated her in front of customers. Irina's just looked away. Finally, one night after they closed up, Miley was in the office counting the drawer and Irina's swept the floor. Chaz entered the office and locked the door. Within seconds, he flew into a tirade, knocking money to the floor. He shouted she was useless and couldn't even count. He pushed Miley out of the way, knocking her to the floor. She crawled out as fast as she could and ran outside past Irina's, crying. Irina's ran for her purse, and that's when Chaz came up from behind her, grinning. He grabbed her face. "Are you gonna be trouble too?" he yelled. He then jumped back. Blood streamed down her face. She was actually crying tears of blood. She smirked as she saw his fear. He watched as his eyes saw her back begin to widen, like something was trying to break free from under her sweater. She lunged at him, digging one hand into his arm so hard it made him cry out. With the other, she grabbed what she was looking for in her purse, a whip with metal spikes. Chaz froze, unable to defend himself as he stared at her, mesmerized as her hair appeared to dance. Irina's hissed as she began to lash him. The first one knocked him to the ground, but the ninth, all the flesh on his torso, had been ripped up. He was barely hanging on. She towered over him, hair now snakes, her shoulders huge wings behind her. With one last heave, the spikes flung straight into his skull, killing him instantly. The next morning, cop cars surrounded the place. Miley had been called into to answer some questions. Dozens of regulars waited outside trying to peer in, but all anyone could see was blood spatter on the windows and a body covered with a sheet on the floor. Miley stood in shock, surveying the carnage. She asked the police officer who was on the floor, fearing it was Irina's. The cop informed her it was an unidentified male. He asked if she had access to the security cameras, so she pulled out her iPad to pull up the footage, but something told her to watch it before sharing it with the police. Her face turned pale and she began to tremble. Richardson walked out of the crowd to comfort her. He explained she had seemed like she needed help, and he hoped it was okay that he had called for her to punish Chaz. As the cop approached, Miley paused. Before he could see, she deleted the file. She claimed the cameras hadn't recorded anything, and she never mentioned Irina's. Miley felt bad for lying to the police, but Chaz had deserved it. Richardson had known it too, as real friends always do. Mio's eyes flew open as she gasped for air. She didn't know why she was outside on the ground, surrounded by emergency workers, or how she even got there. She looked and saw the book titled Socken, meaning gold dust, and that's when everything came flooding back. Mio had always been different, or according to her father, a disappointment who worked in a coffee shop. She had just graduated from Osaka University and was supposed to be headed to medical school, but she never really cared about helping people. Instead, Mio longed to become a successful poet. She took a job as a barista so she could make ends meet while pursuing her dreams. After going through tons of books in the library, she headed to the desk to check them out. The librarian scanned each book, then came to a sudden halt as she held up a collection of poetry titled Socken. "Where did you find this?" she asked in surprise. It wasn't supposed to be on the shelf. The librarian told Mio it was not to be borrowed. The book contained a cursed poem called Tomino's Hell. Anyone who read it or heard the poem out loud suffered terribly, often fatally. The famous director Suji Terayama had made a movie based on the poem and had then died young. Some blamed his sudden death on the curse. The panicked librarian set the book aside while the librarian helped the next customer. Mio snatched the forbidden book from the counter and headed to work. Asuka, Mio's manager, called her out for being late again, but she paid no mind to her manager. Instead, began to daydream, eventually rhyming words, dancing through her head as she went through the motions of making mocha macchiatos. She snapped back to reality quickly when Asuka posted a sign that read, "Open Mic Night." Mio decided this was her chance to sign up and recite a poem she had in her journal. As she flipped through her journal, she began to have second thoughts. Instead, she figured she would look for inspiration in other books she had. The next day, Mio told Asuka she wouldn't be performing her poem. Asuka laughed, saying she knew Mio would bail. Asuka chuckled at her with that mockingbird screech. Her face lit up with joy at her employee's expense. It was in that moment that Mio snapped back and said, "Actually, I am going to read a poem, just not my own." When it was her turn, she pulled out the forbidden book she'd stolen from the library. She finally read Tomino's poem. It was as dark and twisted as she hoped, and it strangely comforted her. The story of Tomino's descending into hell resonated with her deeply. She felt herself spiraling towards darkness, questioning if she'd chosen the right path in life. Tomino's hell. Elder sister vomits blood, younger sister breathing fire, while sweet little Tomino just spits up the jewels. All alone does Tomino go, falling into that hell. The poem was gruesome, not to Asuka's taste, and she turned quickly to go into the kitchen, not realizing she knocked over a candle. Mio continued. A hell of utter darkness without even flowers. Is Tomino's big sister the one who whips him? The purpose of scourging hangs dark in his mind, lashing and thrashing him. Mio saw a flame out of the corner of her eye. In the back, a tablecloth was on fire. But with all eyes on her, she didn't want to pass up the attention. With a smile, Mio read on. Into the blackest of hells, guide him now, I pray. When her audience finally smelled the smoke, they bolted towards the exits, but the route to the front door was covered in flames. The side door had been locked to keep anyone from sneaking into the open mic night. Asuka's fingernails tore and bled from clawing at it, trying to get out, but they were all trapped. Despite the blood-curdling screams and the flames closing in, Mio kept reading. She was determined to finish the cursed poem. And that was the last thing she remembered, before waking up disoriented outside the smoking cafe, realizing she had been rescued by a firefighter. She saw Asuka's dead, burnt body laying close by, covered in ash. Mio couldn't help but wonder if the curse was real. Now that was poetic justice. Mio figured she would find out for sure when she read the poem again at the next open mic night.
Naomi always had trouble sleeping. She'd stay awake for hours trying to drift off, and when she did finally sleep, it was always restless and frequently interrupted. Books and TV didn't help. The only thing that helped was playing her favorite video game, Myrtle's Island. It was a simple concept. You played a character named Myrtle and just explored an isolated tropical island. Naomi found it soothing. During especially restless periods, she'd play it every night. Late one evening, Naomi was enjoying her usual session of the game. She kept playing and playing. She stared at the screen for what must have been hours. After such a long session, she got thirsty and decided to grab a drink. She took her eyes away from the screen and gasped. She was no longer in her bedroom. She was on Myrtle's Island. Naomi thought she must be dreaming. She could really feel the hot sand, really see and hear the lapping waves. To her, this was the coolest dream she'd ever had. However, as she explored the island, something was off. It should be beautiful and sunny, but as she approached the water, it became murky. The sky had gone from pure blue to a deep, cloudy gray. Glancing back to the island, she spotted a figure. Shaggy green pixie hair with silver eyes and a grayish-blue hoodie. Myrtle. She ran up to greet her friend. Myrtle didn't respond or even acknowledge Naomi's presence. She just proceeded towards a small wooden shack in the middle of the island. Naomi was already familiar with this structure. It was the Keeper's Shack, a place where she might find a clue leading to her next adventure. Once inside, she looked around. This, too, was different than she remembered. It was supposed to be a simple shack with a dream catcher and a map on the walls. But inside, it had been torn apart. The words, "You can't run," had been smeared on the walls in what looked like blood. At that, there was a loud banging on the tin roof. They both looked towards the door. Nothing. Suddenly, a sinewy, overly long arm smashed through the roof. Myrtle yelled in pain as it violently yanked her up through the ceiling. As soon as Myrtle was pulled out of view, Naomi heard a loud, wet snap, and Myrtle's yell cut off. Through the window, Naomi saw her lifeless body tossed to the side of the shack. She ran out of the shed as fast as she could. This wasn't a part of the game she knew. But she did know that in the game, there was a dock with a boat nearby. That boat would take her to a separate cove. But when she reached it, the boat was gone. Just then, she heard whatever had killed Myrtle approaching, calling Naomi's name in a screeching, hag-like voice. She looked back and came face to face with a creature, tall and shrouded in darkness, its eyes burning bright into her soul. Before Naomi could react, it pounced. The last thing she felt were the talons scratching at her throat, then the herky-jerky snap of her own neck. Her vision slowly dimmed to all red. The words, "You can't run," appearing before her. She was dead. Then suddenly, she was respawned back in the game again. As she heard the creature again, she tried to run, but it was no use. The creature always won. It always caught her. Her vision turned red, yet as before, she respawned. Over and over, repeatedly. Eventually, instead of trying to run, she faced her nemesis, screaming, "Just end it!" This time, when she opened her eyes, she couldn't see the creature. Something had changed. She was back at the shed. Myrtle appeared, but instead of being pleased to see Naomi, she screamed and tried to run. What in the world? Reaching out to stop her, she gasped in shock. Instead of her own arm, the limb was sinewy and overly long. Initial shock dissipated almost immediately as she was filled with a sudden rage and bloodlust. Screeching in a voice that was not her own, she chased Myrtle down, reaching her easily with newfound speed and agility. She raised the taloned hand to her prey's throat and slit it open, blood gurgling, then twisted her neck. Snap. As Naomi roared in triumph, she realized her final exhausted plea had worked. To some extent, anyway. She was still stuck in the game, respawning over and over, only this time, instead of fearing death, she was the monster. And she liked it. The Cunninghams looked at their new baby, Finley, with their hearts full. She had beautiful, deep brown eyes, and everyone fell in love with her, especially her big brother, Lucas. Despite being only 6 himself, he was fiercely protective. They shared a room, and at night, Lucas would read her bedtime stories. Late at night, he'd peek over and check on Finley, just to make sure she was okay. The night before Finley's first birthday, Lucas awoke to a loud slamming sound. The window had blown open, and the shutters were banging against the walls. He looked over at the crib to see Finley sitting straight up with her eyes closed, mumbling something. She had barely started to say mama or dada yet, so it was unusual for her to be babbling so much. Then she fell silent. Lucas rushed over to her, and Finley's eyes shot open. He was horrified to see her wide, suddenly crystal blue eyes piercing into him. This was not his sister. He ran to wake his parents. They rushed in to check on her, but although taken aback, they mainly seemed unperturbed. They said sometimes a toddler's eye color can change, but Lucas felt no such sense of relief. Over the next few weeks, Finley grew fussy. She didn't want to be held. She cried nonstop, and she destroyed the books Lucas used to read to her. Again, his parents explained that she was approaching the toddler phase, and this was normal. But Lucas had a gut feeling they were wrong. He had a feeling it would get worse, because now he didn't know why, but he was afraid of the sister he'd once adored. Over the next couple of years, Finley grew mean and developed a vicious temper. She threw things at her brother, destroyed his toys, and even bit him. By 3.5, their parents were at their wits' end. They couldn't have company over because her tantrums were too much. They were just this side of dangerous. The only thing that calmed her down was coloring with a red crayon. She'd draw, then scribble over the same pictures over and over again. It was always 2 fairies. One day, when she was oddly quiet, Lucas bravely asked her about the fairies. She said they were her real mommy and daddy, and one day they'd come back for her, and she'd make them pay for what they've done. Lucas was upset and scared. Grabbing her hands, he snapped, yelling that their real mom and dad were in the kitchen. Finley screamed and began hitting him. Her eyes rolled back into her head. She grabbed a sharp pencil and sliced at his face and throat. Blood splattered all over their teddy bears. Lucas's parents rushed in. They grabbed Lucas and rushed him to the hospital. Fortunately, He had survived the attack from Finley, but his parents didn't know what to do, blaming themselves for raising such a naughty child. The night before Finley's 4th birthday, Lucas jumped from his sleep, hearing the shutters clang open across the hall in Finley's room. He sprinted in to see what was happening. The windows had opened so abruptly that the glass panes had shattered on the floor. He rushed to her bed to find Finley sitting up, mumbling. As she slowly opened her eyes, he gasped. They were the same deep brown as the day she was born. She reached for Lucas with a smile on her face, something she hadn't done for years. Their parents ran in wondering what all the noise was, and she ran into their arms. They hoped for a happy end to this mystery. But doctors and psychologists had no answers. A spiritual advisor did. The parents were ready to accept any explanation. She told them that the blue-eyed terror must have been a changeling, that fairies live among us. When they have unruly and sometimes even murderous offspring, they can swap the child to be raised by humans for 3 full years. If their child kills one of the other's family, they get to keep the more peaceful human child. If not, they have to swap them back. The only thing the real Finley remembered was sitting with the fairy mother on the night the changeling was brought home. The changeling's parents didn't want their little sociopath back, but it was fairy law. As Finley and the changeling toddler were exchanged, she felt a dark energy. She looked out of the window and saw the monstrous fairy youngster with red, beady eyes. In the magical realm of the fairies, it would gain more power than it ever could in ours. Floating backward towards its parents, the changeling held Finley's gaze with a wicked grin. "I'll be seeing you again soon, sister." Ailani loved her new place on the Big Island in Hawaii. The rent was cheap and it was an amazing location. There was only one real problem. Her roommate, Maya, was a loud insomniac. At first, Ailani was able to ignore Maya's late-night activity, but with each passing night, it got worse. All the lights outside Ailani's room were always on, and Maya seemed to make strange noises through the apartment all night long. Ailani found herself getting less and less sleep each night, and finally she confronted Maya about it. She thought it was possible that Maya simply didn't realize how much noise she made at night. Maya signed an apology and promised to keep it down, but that night, it was the worst so far. The constant whisking noises and loud stomping, and occasionally Maya raising her voice as well. The only thing Ailani could make out when she did was Maya bursting out in frustration. "I said I'd get it done, I promise. Just don't do anything crazy." The next day, Ailani confronted Maya once again and threatened to move out. She needed her sleep more than anything else. Maya begged her not to leave and offered a solution. "Why don't you take over the master bedroom? It's much quieter in that room, I promise," Maya signed. "I'll even give it to you for the same rent." She also wrote out their agreement on paper as well. Ailani was reluctant to take the offer. The extra space would be nice for the same cheap rent, but she really couldn't afford to lose more sleep because of Maya's weird nighttime habits. Maya insisted that Ailani sleep in the master bedroom tonight just to see how it felt, and if she liked it, they could switch their stuff around tomorrow. Ailani agreed, hoping to finally get a good night's sleep. She had never been in her roommate's bedroom before and was surprised at how beautiful her bed was. Maya explained it was a very sturdy heirloom that had been in her family for generations. A 4-poster canopy bed made from ornately carved mahogany. Ailani couldn't imagine anyone having trouble sleeping in it. That night, she was relieved to find that The master bedroom was much quieter, and she soon fell into a restful and deep sleep. She wasn't sure how long she'd been out when she once again heard that same loud and repetitive brushing sound. To her, it sounded almost like a loud mix of teeth brushing noises with clicking and broom sweeping. It was insidious, invasive. Eilani was furious. Just as she was about to get out of bed and give Maya a piece of her mind, she realized something terrifying. The sounds were coming from under the bed. Eilani froze. Something was in the room with her. She called out to Maya, hoping this was some weird prank, but there was only more skittering and an unsettling clicking sound. In a panic, she reached for her phone, but it wasn't there. Only the cable she had used to charge it. Suddenly, there was tugging on the bedspread. Whatever was moving on the floor was crawling onto the bed. A head poked over the foot of the bed, and for a moment, Eilani thought it was a cat and breathed a sigh of relief. But as more and more, and even more of the creature made its way onto, alongside, and above the bed, the moonlight from the window revealed it fully. It was the biggest bug Eilani had ever seen. She backpedaled up to the head of the bed as the gigantic centipede-like creature slithered towards her and clicked with its giant pincers. Terrified, Eilani glanced over the edge of the bed, and the insect's body coiled everywhere around the floor. Adrenaline spiking, she sprang up and tried to leap from the bed to the door. While she was in midair, whip quick, the creature lunged and wrapped its endless body around her, savagely digging its pincers into her flesh. It let out an insectoid screech as Eilani let out a blood-curdling scream. Maya felt the vibrations of Eilani's screams on the other side of the bedroom door. This offering would keep the Ancient One her family line were caretakers for at bay. Otherwise, the giant insect horror would hunt, reproduce with the smaller yet equally dangerous of its kind, and then there would be slaughter. But for now, the ancient centipede would rest again. It should be sated for months this time. Maya breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, she could get a good night's sleep.
Thanks so much for listening. Like and share if this video gave you the chills. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell for notifications. See you next time.